The committee will come to order. A quorum is present. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 6585, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, H.R. 6655, a Stronger Workforce for America Act, H.J. Res. 98, a joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title V, United States Code, of the rules submitted by the National Labor Relations Board relating to, quote, standard for determining joint employment status, end quote, and H.R. 3400, the Small Businesses Before Bureaucrats Act. The chair announces that requests for recorded votes as to amendments may be postponed pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 14B. Without objection, the chair may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. Good morning and welcome. Today's markup agenda includes 4 items: the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, a Stronger Workforce for America Act, a Congressional Review Act resolution disapproving of the National Labor Relations Board's joint employer rule, and the Small Businesses Before Bureaucrats Act. These 4 bills represent a major chunk of the committee's policy priorities this Congress, so we have a lot of work ahead of us today. I find some of the committee's most important work sits squarely at the intersection of education and the workforce, not entirely dedicated to one or the other. It is at the critical juncture of education and the workforce that young people's lives can change forever. What's the next step after graduating high school? What's your first job in the real world going to be? This uncomfortable truth is that the first job out of high school or college can reverberate throughout the trajectory of one's career. It is especially uncomfortable as modern professionals graduate with more degrees and less to show for them, often treading water by working at the local bar or coffee shop. According to a Strata Institute study titled, quote, "The Permanent Detour," end quote, initial underemployment has lasting consequences. Today, 43% of young professionals enter the workforce overqualified for their job. 29% remain underemployed after 5 years. A total of nearly 1 in 4 hasn't escaped the trap after a decade. The detour comes with a cost, too: $10,000 in lost income per year per worker. The transition from education to career is a critical moment. In its current state, the transition feels like less of a pipeline and more of a tightrope. Fewer than 1 in 5 students move smoothly from high school to college to a career, according to a 2022 report. That is why I emphasize all education is career education. Additional pathways to enter the workforce, along with more reskilling and upskilling opportunities, must become potential off-ramps from the permanent detour. Before us are 2 bipartisan bills which can provide those off-ramps. Together, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act and a Stronger Workforce for America Act will broaden the precarious education tightrope to a true pipeline in which many paths can lead to a rewarding career. I want to thank the ranking member and his staff for working with us on these bills. I think they are stronger pieces of legislation because of our bipartisan work. Also, the committee will consider 2 more bills today, each concerned with the NLRB's burdensome rules and overreach. H.J. Res. 98 is a Congressional Review Act resolution that will nullify the NLRB's final joint employer rule, which recklessly holds a company liable for employees it does not employ or directly supervise. This broadened language will confuse and harm franchisors, franchisees, and entrepreneurs across the country. A similar Obama-era standard cost the franchising sector an estimated $33.3 billion and 376,000 jobs. That's unacceptable. The final bill under consideration today is Representative Bob Good's Small Businesses Before Bureaucrats Act, which shields many small businesses from the board's radical rules and decisions by raising the NLRB's monetary jurisdiction thresholds. Since 1958, the NLRB has declined to assert its jurisdiction over retail businesses with under $500,000 in revenue. The problem is that the $500,000 threshold has been frozen for over 6 decades, and the dollar is not what it once was. Thanks to compounding inflation and more recently Bidenomics, $500,000 in 1958 is worth over $5 million in today's dollars. Representative Bob Good's Small Businesses Before Bureaucrats Act will increase the NLRB's jurisdictional threshold for retail businesses to over $5 million in annual gross volume, a number which reflects the growth of the economy and the modern value of the dollar. Finally, I want to thank the members who've worked together diligently to bring forward these proposals. Because of you, we're considering 4 important common sense pieces of legislation for the betterment of our constituents, the American people. With that, I look forward to the markup, and I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, the committee is marking up 3 bills and 1 resolution. The first 2 are bipartisan bills that you and I have negotiated for nearly a year. They will help workers, they will help students and businesses reap the benefits of our country's growing economy. Regrettably, the other bill and resolution will do the opposite and undermine workers' rights by chipping away at the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act. The first bill we will consider is a Stronger Workforce for America Act, which makes an array of critical improvements to Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs. Specifically, it will ensure that workers displaced from their jobs can access robust development services, including through individual training accounts. It creates an emphasis on employer-led initiatives that equip workers with the skill sets they need to fill jobs in critical industries and help the currently employed workforce upskill to avoid displacement and advance their careers. And finally, it streamlines the eligible trainer provider list to ensure that programs are aligned with the skill and hiring demands, and that state and local workforce boards are held accountable for achieving positive outcomes for program participants. The next bill, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, allows students to use Pell Grants to enroll in high-quality, short-term workforce programs, creating opportunities for Americans working to gain skills in high-demand fields. Currently, students cannot use a Pell Grant on a short-term training program, such as IT or welding courses, and as a result, many adults cannot afford to attend or complete courses that will help them get good-paying jobs and compete in the modern economy. This is a disservice to our students, workers, and employers. We have been trying to expand the use of Pell Grants for years, and I'm excited that we finally reached a bipartisan agreement with solid quality assurance measures to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used on high-quality programs. Too often we hear claims from employers about the difficulties of filling in-demand jobs. But looking at our rural and urban communities reveals that talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. Taken together, these 2 bills are an investment that we need to provide more Americans with a path to the middle class and businesses with the ability to hire the well-trained workers they need. So I'm grateful to Dr. Fox and the committee staff for working together to find a bipartisan solution. Regrettably, this is where our bipartisanship will end. because the next item we will consider is a resolution to repeal the National Labor Relations Board Joint Employer Rule. Millions of Americans have work arrangements where they work on behalf of a client company that directs their work but does not sign their paycheck. This so-called fissured workplace can weaken their ability to organize and collectively bargain or otherwise hold their employer accountable. The NLRB's joint employer rule ensures that workers hired through subcontractors, temporary staffing agencies, or other intermediaries can hold all entities that actually control their working conditions accountable for their right to collectively bargain for higher pay and better benefits in a safer workplace. This resolution would repeal the rule and, if enacted, would reinstate the deficient Trump-era rule that narrowed the joint employer standard and weakened workers' ability to exercise their rights. Under that rule, the entity that controls the pay levels often cannot be brought to the bargaining table, so the whole bargaining process is useless. The last bill before us, the so-called Small Business Before Bureaucrats Act, would significantly increase the revenue threshold under which businesses fall within the NLRB's jurisdiction. The bill's author has said that when implemented, more than 50% of retail and non-retail businesses will be exempt and relieved from NLRB jurisdiction. This bill represents an attack on workers' rights, and the committee Democrats strongly reject it. It is frustrating that the majority included these last two bills as part of today's otherwise bipartisan markup. So I urge my colleagues to support the bills that meaningfully strengthen our workforce, a Stronger Workforce for America Act and the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, and oppose the other two proposals. Thank you, Madam Chair. Now you're back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require that a copy of the measure be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. Pursuant to the notice for today's meeting, a copy of the measure was made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. The bills being marked up today shall be open to amendment at any point, and the chair will allow members to offer amendments in a manner not prohibited by the House or committee rules. Without objection, members who have more than one amendment to a bill and wish to offer their amendments en bloc may do so. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 6655 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6655 to amend and reauthorize the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize Congressman Owens to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. First, the clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I have
Mr. Owens, wait just a second, please.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6655 offered by Mr. Owens of Utah, identifier ANS_01.
Now, Mr. Owens.
Madam Chair, I have amendment.
Just 1 second again. Okay. Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize Congressman Owens for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to offer this amendment in the nature of a substitute for a Stronger Workforce for America Act, H.R. 6655. Almost a decade ago, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, was enacted, marking a pivotal moment in our nation's commitment to enhancing workforce development. It sought to streamline the intricate network of federal programs, yet as time has passed, persistent challenges have hindered the system's ability to connect job seekers and employers. A lot of ink has been spilled in the press recently arguing over the state of the economy, but let's confront reality. The labor market is tight. Employers are struggling to fill nearly 9 million open job positions nationwide. Technological progress now requires a rapidly upskilled and reskilled workforce, or we risk eroding our competitive edge on the global economic stage. WAO designed to tackle these very challenges desperately needs reform. A Stronger Workforce for America Act is the solution. It updates WAO in several critical ways. It dedicates a substantial 50% of adult and dislocated worker funding toward upskilling and a direct investment in fortifying our workforce. It champions employer-led initiatives, equipping workers with the precise skill sets demanded by the industry. It ensures that workers displaced through no fault of their own can access individual training accounts or an indispensable resource. Moreover, it streamlines the eligible training provider list while implementing a robust performance accountability system to ensure states, local workforce boards, and skill development providers are responsible for their outcomes. It helps the vulnerable members of our society have a chance to enter the workforce. This includes youth and formerly incarcerated individuals. Finally, though this list is not nearly exhaustive, it gives state and local workforce boards the breathing room to innovate their workforce systems by including my One Door to Work Act. This legislation, modeled after the Utah model, will encourage the integration of workforce and safety net programs to create one door to lift workers out of poverty and into sustaining careers. We've heard from stakeholders that while the word innovation may be in the name WAO, it's not truly in the law. A Stronger Workforce for America Act changes this and empowers state and local leaders to innovate and pursue the better options and better outcomes. The amendment in the nature of substitute improves the underlying law by making a handful of technical changes and minor modifications to clarify the intent of the legislation. In essence, a Stronger Workforce for America Act stands as a beacon of hope for forgotten Americans. It furnishes the important elements of WAO with accountability, flexibility, and innovative mechanisms to achieve our shared goal of unlocking the world of career opportunities for millions of hardworking Americans. Together, let's embrace the pivotal steps toward providing a high-quality service to job seekers and employers and pass a Stronger Workforce for America Act. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I made comments on the bill in an opening statement. I'd just like to thank the gentleman from Utah for introducing the amendment in nature of a substitute. We've been working on this since the last Congress. We couldn't come to a conclusion. I'm delighted that we were able to. This version includes a lot of important initiatives, including a focus on those that are hard to place, such as those who have been involved in the justice system, and a nice focus on juveniles and youth employment. So I thank the gentleman for introducing the amendment nature of a substitute, and I plan to support it.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Are there any members who wish to be recognized? Mr. Allen?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I rise in support of a Stronger Workforce for America Act. Having built a small business from the ground up, I have experienced firsthand just how hard it can be to find skilled and qualified workers. And it's never been harder than right now. With over 9 million unfilled jobs, it is imperative that we move past the status quo and recognize that many good-paying jobs that don't require a 4-year college degree are available and to those with the right skill sets. This critical piece of legislation will make much-needed improvements to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act to ensure WAO dollars are actually dedicated to upskilling the workforce and making the shift to skills-based hiring. I was also glad to see language from my Startup Act included in H.R. 6655 to support American entrepreneurs by expanding access to programs that offer training and resources to individuals seeking to start their own business. We have a modern workforce today, and many of that are participating in that workforce are entrepreneurs. With the Startup Act language included, entrepreneurs and future entrepreneurs will be connected with the resources that they need to grow a business, create jobs, and strengthen our economy. America has always been a nation of trailblazers, so we need to ensure that we in Congress are doing our part to equip our workforce with the proper tools needed to spark innovation and achieve the American dream. In the greatest economy in my lifetime, just a few years ago, the entrepreneurs and small businesses created 70% of all new jobs. As a proud co-sponsor, I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Ms. McBath, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. Thank you so much. I really appreciate, moving to strike the last word. But anyway, thank you so much, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and specifically to your respective workforce teams. In my 5 years in Congress, I have seen multiple bipartisan negotiations fall apart, including WIOA. When that happens, there are no winners, and the American people, those that we are sworn to protect and serve, they lose the most. I know how difficult it is to get substantive quality bills introduced that both parties support, and I fully believe that this is what we are considering here today. With this bill, we are showing the American people that regardless of what they see on social media or what they see on television, that there are people still here in Washington that are willing to engage in good faith efforts together to get something positive done for the country. The Stronger Workforce for America Act is the culmination of years of work and makes important changes to a landmark bill that Chairwoman Fox played an integral role in getting signed into law with the help of President Obama in 2014. I've worked closely with the committee to incorporate key provisions of the multiple workforce bills that I have introduced with the help of my colleagues in this Congress: the TRAIN Act, the Adult Education Works Act, and my Credential Repositories Bill, all of which help to improve and modernize our education and workforce systems to adapt to a changing economy and meets the needs of students, employers, and employees alike. Like the TRAIN Act, this bill emphasizes our need to lean into programs that are proven to work and codifies the Department of Labor's Strengthening Community College Training Grant Program. This year alone, this important program has facilitated tens of millions of federal dollars in assistance to the technical college system of Georgia, my home state, and other community college systems around the country to increase capacity in high-need fields of study and set up partnerships with local employers to recruit and train talent for in-demand sectors of the economy like healthcare, cybersecurity, and advanced manufacturing. It includes key provisions from the bipartisan and bicameral Adult Education Works Act, such as codifying our public libraries' important role in delivering these services, the professionalization of the adult education workforce, and incentivizing full-time staffing models, as well as emphasizing the need for every American to be digitally proficient in an increasingly online world. The credential navigation tool, similar to my bill, the CREATES Act, will help provide greater transparency for students and job seekers, workers, and employers to understand and compare the value of post-secondary credentials so that they can make the best decision on where to invest their time and their resources. Once again, I applaud the chair and the ranking member for helping us come together on these really vitally important issues. I encourage everyone here to vote in favor of this bill today and on the floor when the time comes. And I'm hopeful that we can finally get this reauthorized through the Senate and signed into law by the President. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. McBath. I appreciate very much your good comments about the fact that we can show people that we will work together for the good of the country. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and a special thanks to you, Ranking Member Scott, and all the staff for the hard work on creating this bipartisan product. I'm proud to speak today in strong support of this legislation, which will strengthen the federal workforce system and increase access to high-quality and in-demand jobs nationwide. While WIOA was successful in many respects, including supporting educational services to help adults develop basic skills and providing funding for vocational rehabilitation services for individuals with disabilities, additional reforms are needed to respond to the challenges the employers are facing in filling open jobs. I'm particularly pleased to see additional funding directed towards upskilling the workforce, including by giving states a new tool through the Critical Industry Skills Fund to help employers upskill, hire, and retain workers in critical industries. I'm also pleased to see additional emphasis on digital literacy within this legislation, as we all know that these skills are necessary to succeed today. Together, these reforms will ensure workers remain relevant for the rapidly changing 21st century economy. As the co-chair of the Bipartisan Career and Technical Education Caucus, I'm also grateful to see the better alignment with state activities authorized through Perkins. This coordination will allow for expanded integrated education and training programs, assistance to providers in reporting participant outcomes, and additional materials to meet the needs of adult and English learners. I also want to thank the committee for including my bipartisan legislation, the Creating Opportunities to Thrive and Advance Act, which will bolster career counseling programs and allow for public outreach to educate Americans on workforce development programs. These provisions will fuel innovation, they will help transition to a skills-based economy, and ultimately build a stronger and more resilient workforce. I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Sablon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chair, first I want to thank you, Chairwoman Fox, and Ranking Member Scott for the bipartisan work that it took to get us to this point. I also want to thank the staff for the hard work over a long period of time. I'm very grateful also that my bill, the Employment Services and Jobs Parity Act, is included in H.R. 6655. It has been a long-standing priority of mine, along with the gentle lady from American Samoa, to include the Northern Mariana Islands and the American Samoa under the Wagner-Pacers Act. It is not what I was looking for, but I will take this agreement nonetheless. We are the only two remaining U.S. jurisdictions ineligible to participate in the critical programs under Wagner-Pacer. For my home, the bill would fill a critical gap in the workforce development services we're able to provide employees by adding the Northern Marianas to the fundamental federal employment service, the work opportunity tax credit, and the Jobs for Veterans State Grants program. Strengthening available services for our workers and businesses is needed now more than ever before. The Marianas and American Samoa has a reliance on U.S. workers that has contributed to ongoing disruptions for our workforce. Our only hospital, for example, anticipates losing nearly 30 non-U.S. nurses over the next 6 to 8 months. Making investments in the Marianas workforce as Wagner-Pacer programs who do help ensure we have work-ready U.S. workers well prepared to meet the needs of businesses and employers. So I strongly support H.R. 6655. We have bipartisan agreement now. It's the time to upgrade America's economic competitiveness by making sure job seekers and employers in the Marianas throughout the United States have access to the same high-quality services as other Americans everywhere else in the United States does. Again, Chairwoman Fox, thank you. I know you had some reluctance to agreeing to this item in a previous bill, but thank you, and Chairwoman, Ranking Member Scott, for the commitment to work together to support U.S. workers and employers in this way and to reach bipartisan agreement. I yield back the balance of my time. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Sablon. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate the bipartisan approach to drafting a Stronger Workforce for America Act. I know that at least the three of us, Ranking Member Scott and Chairwoman Fox and myself, were at the bill signing for the last Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act in 2014, and it's long overdue for an update. Each time this committee has met to discuss workforce development this Congress, we've been focused, we've been bipartisan and productive, and it's evident that those hearings set the stage for the careful negotiations that resulted in this needed reauthorization for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So thank you to the staff on both sides of the aisle for their work helping to craft this legislation that will help millions of American workers and families. Investments in developing, upscaling, and reskilling our workforce are essential to economic security and growing the middle class. As President Biden has said, we need to grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. As existing industries and jobs transform and as new industries emerge and as our workforce diversifies, we need supportive resources and wraparound services in place to provide workers with the training and resources they need to be successful. And a Stronger Workforce for America Act provides these supports, and I will be supporting the bill. This legislation expands access to funding for skills development services for displaced workers through flexible individual training accounts. It reaffirms the strength of partnerships between schools, colleges, and employers to create or improve programs that connect students with high-skill, high-wage, or in-demand careers and meet the needs of local employers. And importantly, it strengthens opportunities for students and workers to participate in work-based learning aligned with their career pathway so they can learn new skills and attain a relevant credential while earning a living wage. I'm appreciative that this bill includes provisions from my bipartisan Access to Career Counseling for Every Secondary Student, or Access Act, which I introduced with Representative G.T. Thompson. The Access Act increases public awareness and access to career counseling about high-skill, high-wage, or in-demand industries or sectors for youth served by WIOA programs. Northwest Oregon is home to many critical industries, including clean energy and semiconductors, that are growing in large part because of significant investments passed last Congress. The inclusion of a new permitted set-aside in the bill for states to support skills development in critical industries will support the creation of thousands of new jobs in the district I'm honored to represent, and it will provide community colleges, workforce development boards, and other training providers with the support and guidance they need to prepare workers to fill high-demand industries. I understand that bipartisan negotiations, especially under budgetary constraints, can result in difficult compromises on both sides of that aisle, and to that end, I'm disappointed that my bipartisan bicameral Builds Act to provide dedicated grant funding for industry or sector partnerships was not included in the Stronger Workforce for America Act. This legislation, bipartisan legislation, supports the development of stronger industry and sector partnerships, access to high-quality work-based learning and registered apprenticeship programs, and access to wraparound services that will improve the likelihood of successful completion in workforce development programs. I'm hopeful that the Builds Act or some form of sector partnership funding crosses the finish line as part of a reauthorization by the end of Congress. So the Stronger Workforce for America Act will make a meaningful difference in people's lives, and that's what our constituents sent us here to do. So thank you again, Chair and Ranking Member, and your staff for this work on your work on this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. I want to take a point of personal privilege and recognize Rosemary Lahaski, who's in the audience today, and say that we wouldn't have gotten the bill passed a few years ago without her help. So I appreciate Rosemary so much, and appreciate her staying involved and relevant to this process. And I recognize Mr. Smucker for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really pleased that we're considering this legislation today. It will take huge strides towards improving our nation's workforce development programs, which we all refer to as WIOA. And this is critically important at a time when industries are crying out for more workers. One particular provision of this bill that is particularly important to my constituents is the measure that streamlines the eligible training provider list, or ETPL, which training providers must apply for in order to access the WIOA system. I've heard from businesses in my district that have told me that the process of applying to the ETPL is particularly burdensome and time-consuming, And in the end, they often simply don't have the bandwidth to apply and end up declining to participate in WIO altogether. So this is an important provision, I think, that will reduce the red tape. It will simplify those procedures, which will in turn ensure that high-quality programs will be able to access the ETPL and use WIO dollars for their programs that do meet strong employment outcomes. And then several other provisions that have been important to me that I've worked on that are included in this legislation. I'm grateful for that. One is significant portions of my bipartisan bill, been working on with other members, to codify the reentry program were included in the text of this legislation. This program provides grants to promote and assist those exiting the justice system as they seek a job and reenter our communities. The bill we're considering today would implement rigorous performance metrics on eligible workforce development programs, including faith-based organizations, local workforce development boards, and others, to ensure the individuals they assist are obtaining stable employment and incentivized not to reoffend. My provisions are not creating a new program, but rather they are reasserting congressional oversight over the reentry program that has existed outside of statute. In this way, our body will be able to enforce outcomes metrics and help build a stable workforce pipeline for those exiting the justice system. And then the final point I'd like to bring up is we're also including a piece of legislation in this bill that I was co-honored to lead with my friend from Texas, Congressman Moran, which extends eligibility for individualized training accounts to in-school youth. More and more young people today are realizing that there are education options besides a traditional four-year university, and they want to enter the workforce on a different, faster timeline in many cases. If they are otherwise eligible for WIO programs, young people that are still in school should have access to these ITAAs that allow them to receive workforce development training, take steps towards their future career in in-demand industries. So to conclude, a Stronger Workforce for America Act, which we're considering today, includes meaningful reforms that will make the WIOA system more impactful, will develop a new generation of workers who can meet the needs of our communities. So I'm really proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill today and urge all of my colleagues to vote yes. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smucker. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I'd like to express my support for this legislation. WIO authorization is long overdue, and I'm pleased to see a bipartisan product come before this committee. It is not quite the miracle that we experienced when we reformed No Child Left Behind in December of the last year of the Obama administration, but it comes close to that, whether you want to call it a Hanukkah miracle, a Christmas miracle, or a holiday miracle. It's a miracle along those lines. There are some important wins in this legislation, and I'm appreciative to see focus on opportunity youth and a greater emphasis on targeting and strengthening partnerships within community colleges. And as a former community college trustee, I have seen firsthand the unique and active role community colleges play in preparing students for a constantly evolving workforce. Community colleges have the tools to prepare students for the future, and through this reauthorization, we are creating even more pathways to economic opportunity. That said, I am sensitive to the unique needs of counties across the country, including Riverside County in my district, or actually I'd rather say my district is inside Riverside County, that may be impacted by changes to local workforce board redesignations as dictated in Section 115. Now, Riverside County is the fourth largest county in the state and the 10th largest in the country. An expansion of this workforce development area could exacerbate the system further. While no changes will occur to any local workforce boards for 2 years, I would be remiss not to mention the potential impacts during this reauthorization hearing or markup. The bill specifically contains language stating local workforce boards should work with the governor. As one of the largest workforce boards, Riverside would not be subject to being encompassed by a potential competing region. And if the governor wants to redesignate and the majority of local workforce boards vote and agree to that dynamic, then and only then will the changes go through. So having the governor work directly with local workforce boards gets at the heart of what members are seeking to accomplish with the WIOA reauthorization, partner with entities that know firsthand what their districts need. My conclusion is the Riverside County Workforce Board area is a sizable one and will not be subjected to detrimental changes. And so therefore, I want to let my folks back in Riverside County know that, and I urge my colleagues to support the underlying legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Tucano. Mr. Moran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I speak today on H.R. 6655, a Stronger Workforce for America Act, to support this bill. The improvements made by WIOA provided in this bill will strengthen the workforce development system and offer career opportunities for millions of Americans. This legislation makes critical improvements to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that will put more Americans on a pathway to successful careers. A Stronger Workforce for America Act upgrades the skills of the American workforce by dedicating 50% of the adult and dislocated worker funding towards upskilling workers. This is very important. A Stronger Workforce for America Act also ensures workers displaced from their jobs through no fault of their own can access robust skill development services. As the owner of a staffing company before coming to Congress, I recognize the need to upskill workers at every turn. In fact, just yesterday, meeting with members and individuals that are connected with the staffing association across this nation, that was their number one ask, was we need to find a way to upskill workers throughout this nation. Included within a Stronger Workforce for America Act is a bill that I had the opportunity of leading with Congressman Smucker called the Building Youth Skills Workforce Act. This will allow eligible in-school youth to access skills development programs by using individual training accounts. It's a very important thing. As they determine what their future looks like, as they find their passion in this life, and they realize that every passion does not need to involve a 2 or 4 year degree, this Stronger Workforce for America Act provides that pathway for those students to be able to fulfill their call in this life. And as a result, I'm proud that my portion of the Stronger Workforce for America Act makes significant advancements for in-school youth who face barriers to education, training, and employment. Overall, this bill will create a demonstration authority for targeted state and local boards to reimagine their workforce systems, and provide technical assistance to employers on implementing skills-based hiring practices. The more creativity we can incentivize at the local level, the better off our workforce will be, because they can work with the businesses in their local community to determine what skills are needed. They can assist with both high school and college-age students, and frankly, students of any age who are looking to upskill and become part of a new workforce. This bill does that, provides new opportunities, new pathways, and as a result, I'm proud to support H.R. 6655, a Stronger Workforce for America Act. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the Stronger Workforce for America Act, a bipartisan effort to provide critical updates to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. The economy has added on average 415,000 jobs every month since President Biden has been in office, and unemployment rates are at an all-time low. Workers across the country are gaining higher wages. A stronger workforce is vital to the economic development of this country. However, an increasing number of jobs in the U.S. require some type of post-secondary education or training, and we are not doing enough to make sure that our workforce is ready for these jobs. It's estimated that 80% of all jobs require some level of post-secondary education or training. And although college has proven to be the surest path to economic mobility, removing the requirement for post-secondary degrees for some occupations will lead to increased access for jobs. Furthermore, structural barriers like housing and food and insecurity, childcare and transportation exclude many skilled people, disproportionately women and minorities, from our nation's workforce. We need to ensure that we increase skills development opportunities for our workers, especially those who choose not to go to take a traditional route of an undergraduate education. As a former college professor and educator for over 40 years at Bennett College in North Carolina, I know what it means to train our young people for the workforce, and I also know that college is not necessarily the path for everyone. Too many young men and women have been pushed out and are now sitting on the sidelines of our economy. Of course, this bill makes an array of key improvements to Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs, such as expanding and improving the quality of skills development, strengthening services for disconnected youth, and codifying grants to help individuals released from incarceration transition back to employment and sustainable careers. Additionally, the bill includes digital literacy skills as a key component to adult education, among other provisions. In a society where we are digitally connected, it's important that our workers have the necessary tools to be competitive and competent on the job. With employers struggling to fill millions of unfilled jobs, a shrinking workforce, and rapidly changing skills needs, it's imperative that our nation provide more opportunities and on-ramps for those seeking to develop the skill necessary for in-demand jobs. This bipartisan effort to diversify and to make critical improvements to our workforce is necessary. Our youth need us. They need us to create a variety of pathways to success for them. So let's make sure that the future of our workforce is truly innovative and reflective of the incoming and reimagined workforce we see today. And let's ensure that our workers are able to attain good-paying jobs. The country is counting on us, and we need to deliver. It is the next step, this legislation is, to build our economy, and I urge my colleagues to continue the bipartisan efforts in the Congress by supporting this bill. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
This bill is a meaningful step towards bolstering workforce development programs in the United States. Since Biden took office, we have seen more than 14 million new jobs, and the unemployment rate has been below 4% for nearly 2 years. The most recent job report shows that nearly 200,000 new jobs were created in November. However, we know that the economy has not been improving for everyone at the same pace, particularly young people. Research by the Connecticut Opportunity Project shows that nearly 1 in 5 of Connecticut's 14 to 26-year-olds were either at risk or disconnected between 2021 and 2022. Many of these youth have disabilities, are homeless, or are involved with the juvenile justice or child welfare system. Only 40% of young people who experienced disconnection 1 year after exiting high school were employed at the age of 22. Those with jobs had median wages of just around $14,000 per year, well below the level needed for economic independence in Connecticut. Among those who neither completed high school nor entered the workforce, 31% were employed at age 22 with a median annual wage of just $8,000. These young people are at increased risk of financial insecurity, homelessness, and incarceration. We Always Youth programs are the key to reconnecting young people to education and employment and helping them realize a better future for themselves. The bipartisan Stronger Workforce for America Act will help to solidify the job gains that we have seen from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act, and connect more young people to job opportunities and training that match the needs of their community. In particular, I'm pleased to see that this bill incorporates language from my bill, the Youth Build for the Future Act. It also contains provisions for the Opening Doors for Youth Act, which I co-led with Ranking Member Bobby Scott, Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, and Congressman Chuy Garcia. The new broader definition of opportunity youth in this bill will ensure that this population is more easily connected to education and work opportunities, and that programs receiving WIOA funds face fewer administrative burdens in helping vulnerable young people. This legislation will also improve the programs that offer summer and year-round employment to opportunity youth, requiring them to match participants with an appropriate high-quality summer employment opportunity. The Stronger Workforce for America Act will make several important updates to the Youth Build program, one of our nation's best programs for supporting opportunity youth. Youth Build helps about 5,000 participants earn their high school diploma each year or equivalent while learning skills in high trades like construction, healthcare, information technology, and logistics. In 2022, 75% of Youth Build participants nationwide obtained a high school diploma or equivalency. 45% went on to post-secondary education jobs and earned an average of $15 per hour in their placement. In court-involved students, participation saw just 6% recidivism rate. These programs work. The new updates will allow states to have access to wage data systems and making their reporting burden requirements lessen. The Secretary of Labor will also be required to announce new funding for opportunity grants at the same time each year, which helps them to better plan their budgets. But most critically, Youth Build programs will now be able to use their funds for participant meals. Hunger is a significant issue for opportunity youth, whose programs will now be able to provide certainty while their participants focus on education and career opportunities. These programs provide life-changing support for opportunity youth, and they should be fed while they are on these campuses. These changes will expand their reach, increase their success, and save taxpayers money by bolstering our workforce. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and look forward to supporting its passage through the House of Representatives very soon. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. For what purpose does the gentlelady, Ms. Omar, seek recognition?
Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6655, offered by Ms. Omar of Minnesota. Identifier OMAR-MN_066.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you. While I support this compromise bill, it's far from perfect and our work is not done. This legislation needs refinement, especially in areas like funding flexibility and labor consultation, to truly meet the unique needs of our communities. We must recognize that workforce development is not a one-denominational challenge solved by just training alone. From career to support services, there are equally vital components of worker empowerment that have not been sufficiently addressed in this bill. These services can be pivotal in connecting training with successful employment and economic outcomes. That is why I want to highlight my amendment to modernize and expand wraparound services for program participants. This amendment draws from legislation I introduced last year called the Supportive Services Enhancement Act. It would expand the definition of supportive services to include mental health and substance abuse treatment, as well as internet access. More importantly, it requires the local provision of these services directly to adult participants. I'm disappointed to see this language left out of this current bill, especially when it was included in the base text of our last proposed reauthorization. Excluding such provisions is a missed opportunity for genuine progress towards fair and effective access to training programs. As we continue to improve our workforce training programs, we must ensure people have their basic needs met so that they can fully participate and thrive in our economy. Housing, childcare, healthcare, and broadband access are all part of workforce development, and it is time we start treating them as such. While I'm relieved to see improvements to job training programs, the underlying access issues need further attention. Therefore, I will withdraw my amendment today with the expectation that this dialogue continues, and I hope we will remember to address workforce development in a holistic way moving forward. I will continue to push for strengthened community input, supportive services, and labor standards in any future WIOA reauthorization. We must focus on supporting the voices and well-being of workers, not just employers, in our workforce development system. I yield the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yield.
I yield the remaining time to Ranking Member Bobby Scott.
Thank you. For the reasons that the gentlelady from Minnesota just mentioned, I think we need to work on this, but we need to go forward with the bill as it is. But as we go forward, this is a very important provision that needs to be addressed. I yield to the gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. And we know we will be negotiating with the Senate, and there's more work that can be done on this bill to make it as strong as it possibly can be. So I appreciate your willingness to work with me and the rest of the members of the committee. I've really appreciated all the comments being made as we show the American people this bill is made up of pieces from lots of different members, and that's the way it should be. We'll continue to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you both.
My understanding is that you've yielded back.
I yield the remaining of my time, yes.
And you've withdrawn the amendment. Thank you. Does any other member have an amendment to offer?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6655 offered by Mr. Good of Virginia. Identifier Good_02.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Apprenticeships play a vital role in developing the American workforce. Virginia is a leading state with more than 2,000 apprenticeships across the Commonwealth. Current law requires apprenticeships to be registered with the Department of Labor to receive funding and participate in WIOA programs. For any employer looking for funding for your apprenticeships, it's easy. Just let Acting Secretary Sue and President Biden run your apprenticeship program for you. Julie Sue and Joe Biden are career politicians. The Acting Secretary cannot even get formally confirmed to her current job, and the President, of course, has no experience running a business, unless you count the President's experience being in business with his son Hunter, collecting money from China and Ukraine. My amendment, however, would let employers run their own apprenticeship program without overbearing oversight from executive agencies. We've all heard from employers in our districts about the unemployment problems and skills gap in our workforce. My amendment bets on the know-how of American business owners to fix the problems better than we can do it here in Washington. Employers need the freedom to develop the training models that work best for their employees. They don't need government bureaucrats in the Department of Labor telling them how many boxes to check. In my district, I've gotten questions from my constituents on this particular issue, and whether they need to comply with the Washington knows best mentality to be eligible for funding. The current system puts at a disadvantage those who don't want to get Julie Sue's blessing for their decisions. My amendment would level the playing field in a way that is fiscally responsible and will be a long-term investment in the American workforce. So I urge my colleagues to support American business owners instead of Washington bureaucrats and vote in favor of my amendment. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. As I've said before, H.R. 6655 is a bipartisan bill that reflects compromise on the items we disagree on in order to achieve the many important priorities shared by Republicans and Democrats alike. I will also note that the workforce system under WIOA and the improvements made by H.R. 6655 provide for a, quote, all of the above approach, end quote, to work-based learning that includes registered apprenticeships, as well as other employer-led and on-the-job upskilling programs. This amendment seeks to strike the provision in current law that allows registered apprenticeship programs to be included on a state's ETPL without having to jump through additional hoops. H.R. 6655 retains that provision and extends the same treatment to programs at institutions of higher education eligible for Workforce Pell, as these programs are subject to very strong guardrails to ensure high quality and should also be included on the ETPL without requiring more paperwork and bureaucracy. Also, other work-based learning programs will continue to be eligible for a state's ETPL if they meet the law's performance requirements and may be provided outside of the ETPL under the long-standing exceptions that exist for on-the-job and other employer-connected upskilling opportunities. The amendment also strikes the reference to registered apprenticeships in the Youth Build program in current law, which encourages but does not require the skills development to be coordinated with a registered apprenticeship or a pre-apprenticeship. For these reasons, I oppose the amendment and encourage my colleagues to join me in opposition. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for the reasons you've articulated and the reason that the registered apprenticeships have a reputation of being high quality and provide national recognition, I would agree with you and oppose the amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment from the gentleman from Virginia? The question is on the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Virginia, Good, underline 02. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed
Madam
to.
Chair, I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman has requested a recorded vote. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Are there any other amendments to be offered?
Madam Chair, I have another amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6655 offered by Mr. Good of Virginia, identifier Good _120.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment will strike the provisions of this bill that relate to Job Corps and will once and for all eliminate the program. I ask, are we willing to eliminate any government programs, even those failing or non-performing? Is there any standard for elimination? Job Corps is a failed experiment to theoretically help underserved youth advance in their career field. In fiscal 23, and again under this bill, it will cost taxpayers $1.76 billion. For years, government reports have documented how Job Corps facilities across the board fail to maintain basic safety and security standards for program participants. This committee has even held hearings on these deficiencies in the past. A 2018 GAO report showed that Job Corps centers reported 13,673 safety and security incidents involving students in just 11 months, of which drug-related incidents and assaults accounted for 48% of all the reported incidents. If Job Corps was a company, it would have gone out of business. If it was a college campus, it would have been closed. The Trump administration's Department of Labor implemented the recommendations from one 2018 GAO report, including the development of a comprehensive plan for Job Corps safety and security. Yet this past August, GAO issued yet another report titled, Department of Labor could improve Job Corps safety and security procedures and assess hiring flexibilities for drug intervention specialists. This time, the report focused on the problem of drugs on campus. Second chances for Job Corps have simply run out. When asked to account for their success before the Department of Labor's Inspector General, the Job Corps contractors could not demonstrate that they had assisted participants in finding jobs for 94% of the placements in the sample report. We can't continue pumping money into a program with a 6% success rate. Participants either found jobs through their own efforts or without clearly documented Job Corps assistance. Again, can we not eliminate any unjustified or unperforming government programs? Ronald Reagan famously said there's nothing more permanent than a temporary so-called government program. This committee needs to admit that Job Corps does not effectively fulfill its mandate, as it fails to measurably help young people achieve greater career success, certainly not to justify borrowing nearly $2 billion on an annual basis to fund it. It's past time we pretend that Job Corps is an effective solution to help Americans find employment. I hope my colleagues agree and support this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I yield myself 5 minutes. My strong negative opinion of the Job Corps program is no secret, but H.R. 6655 is a bipartisan bill that reflects compromise on the items we disagree on in order to achieve the many important priorities shared by Republicans and Democrats alike. The legislation includes many necessary reforms to make Job Corps accountable for performance, safer for students and staff, and more innovative to keep pace with the ever-changing demands of industry. H.R. 6655 increases the performance threshold for a Job Corps operator to have its contract renewed and raises the bar a Job Corps campus must meet to avoid performance improvement actions, while requiring the Department of Labor to take more substantial action upon repeat and chronic failures. The bill directs each Job Corps campus to develop an agreement with law enforcement for the prompt reporting and investigation of illegal activity and establishes new campus and student safety standards. It also gives clear direction that the Department of Labor can continue the Job Corps Scholars Program established under the Trump administration to award funding to institutions of higher education to provide career and technical education to Job Corps eligible students. H.R. 6655 makes common sense and overdue reforms to improve the Job Corps program. For these reasons, I very regretfully oppose the amendment. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Just very quickly, Madam, I move to strike last word. Madam Chair, I appreciate the compromise that you reached with Chairman Scott, with Ranking Member Scott, and my own reservation has to do with the drug testing. But you know, this is a compromise, and there are things we don't like about it on each side. But ultimately, I can live with this compromise, and WIOA is far too important not to get done, and I want to praise the work that you and Mr. Scott got done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Takano. Is there further debate on the amendment? Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I just would like to say that I appreciate your commitment to honoring the bipartisan agreement that was agreed upon by you and Ranking Member Scott and the rest of the committee members. I think it's, to your point, no secret that we are far apart on the issue of WIOA and workforce reauthorization, but we've worked really hard to come to some consensus and show the American people that we can get things done. And I am hopeful that the work of this committee today will be an example of that. These programs are too important. Our youth depend on them for literally their survival. They change trajectories, they change lives. So scorching the earth and removing everything is not the way to move forward. If it were up to me, we would invest in all of these things. making sure that our kids have mental health and addiction services, making sure that there are job opportunities, making sure that we address homelessness and hunger and all of the things that are barriers to success for young people. But today, WIOA is where we're at. So I will support this amendment. I will support this legislation. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment and vote against it. And again, I appreciate the work of this committee in coming to a bipartisan consensus where, again, no one gets everything that they want, but we have to start somewhere and be focused on at least moving in the right direction. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Virginia, Good _120. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I request recorded vote, please.
The gentleman from Virginia requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
I have another amendment at the desk, Madam Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6655 offered by Mr. Good of Virginia, identifier Good _121.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you. Today, this committee is reauthorizing programs to help Americans displaced from work. It's important to note that welfare programs, or the lack thereof, are not the solution to our workforce problems. In fact, welfare programs are largely a significant source of those problems, and we need to address one of the biggest crises we do face as a country, our wide open borders. Illegal aliens are being chosen over Americans for American jobs. Illegal workers provide many advantages for some companies because they cost $0 in taxes, and they often accept lower wages for more work. The federal government has dozens of policies that favor foreign workers over American workers, even in situations where the foreign workers enter or remain in the United States illegally. The perfect example is the federal government's current policies regarding employment authorization documents, or EADs. When someone enters the United States legally, they receive an EAD, which allows them to work legally in the United States. However, Secretary Mayorkas is mishandling his parole authority, which is supposed to be offered to illegal aliens only on a case-by-case basis. But the Biden administration's DHS is currently releasing entire groups of illegal aliens into the country on parole, which removes wait times from asylum laws and instead immediately makes these illegal aliens immediately eligible for EADs. An expert witness before this very committee testified in September that there are nearly 2 million illegal aliens who have literally been told by a federal judge to leave the country, but they're still authorized to work by President Biden's Department of Homeland Security. Does anyone think they're ever going to leave under that circumstance? It's clear the president will do nothing to protect our borders or prioritize American workers. Congress needs to stop, however, incentivizing illegal immigration, which is an oxymoron because you cannot truly immigrate illegally. Policies that contribute to the historic illegal immigration we are experiencing at the end of the policies that contribute to the historic illegal immigration that we're experiencing are the end of the Remain in Mexico policy, the reinstatement of catch and relief, the promise of amnesty, and the promise of a job. My amendment would address one of these and ensure that every employer participating in WIOA programs would have to participate in mandatory E-Verify and simply confirm that their employees are legally able to work in this country. I know this will be critiqued as partisan, but why is following our legal immigration laws partisan? That didn't used to be the case. Why is it controversial today for members elected by Americans to protect American jobs? Illegal immigration costs taxpayers an estimated $450 billion every year. That's a borrowed $450 billion every year. As this committee looks today to authorize $6.38 billion in taxpayer spending, protecting these programs from those who might seek to abuse it should be a top priority. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. to implement the use of E-Verify for all employers participating in WIOA. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I recognize the intent of this amendment and support the expansion of E-Verify, but securing our border and reforming our immigration laws are more appropriately addressed by the Judiciary Committee and not through a piecemeal approach pertaining only to employers that use the WIOA system. Again, we have a strong bipartisan bill before this committee that makes major improvements to the current law. I have an agreement with the ranking member on this legislation and will be opposing this amendment. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Virginia, Good_121. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair, I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, the vote will be postponed. We will now move to consider the next bill. The committee will proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 6585 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 6585 to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to extend federal Pell Grant eligibilities to certain short-term workforce programs.
Good morning. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. And now, the clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute, which I will offer.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6585 offered by Ms. Fox of North Carolina, identifier ANS.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I'm offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6585, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. I want to thank Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Ranking Member Scott, and Congressman DeSaulnier for their work in support of this important bipartisan legislation. This bill today is the product of hard work from all involved. Our skills education system is changing. A so-called four-year degree isn't for everyone. Many in-demand careers require skills that can be gained from a short-term program. Completing a high-quality short-term skills education program can set up a student with a good job that can serve them for a lifetime at just a fraction of the cost. Our country has nearly 9 million jobs open and over 6 million unemployed individuals. Federal policy isn't aligned with this reality and needs to recognize that there are more pathways to a good job after high school than just a degree. This bill will provide critical support to help low-income families attain post-secondary education. As the environment and demands for skill development and post-secondary education have evolved, our system for student aid must evolve with it. The Pell Grant is cornerstone of the federal government's commitment to providing access and opportunity to all students. But the Higher Education Act currently does not allow Pell Grants to be used for short-term programs. This bill fixes this problem, retooling the Pell Grant to provide opportunities to low-income students to enter high-quality short-term programs to learn skills and move into a job quickly. It crafts a strong, high-quality assurance system for these workforce Pell Grant programs, assuring there's a return on investment by taxpayer dollars. These programs must be high quality, and the bill requires they align with the reality of what skills are in demand, verifying that there are high job placement rates for students with positive earning outcomes. The requirements in this bill are stronger than any other Title IV student aid program. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute, makes small changes to the bill. It ensures that a state Perkins agency's definition of, quote, high skill, high wage, end quote, is utilized by the State Workforce Development Board when determining if a short-term program meets the requirements to be a Workforce Pell Grant program. It adds a requirement that institutions with eligible Workforce Pell Grant programs post the information on their website as required by the bill using common, linked, open, and interoperable data formats 3 years after the Secretary of Education grants the institution Workforce Pell eligibility. It provides technical clarification that related organizations of an institution are also part of an applicable educational institution that's subject to taxation. And last, it clarifies that an institution subject to the endowment tax can utilize campus-based aid funds to cover the cost of attendance for Pell Grant students. And it clarifies that the authorization of appropriations in Section 8 is funding for the Secretary to implement this program in the first 5 years. I urge the committee to adopt my amendment and vote yes on the underlying bill to unlock crucial skills development opportunities for students. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, under present law, a Pell Grant can only be used for college courses. If a Pell Grant only leads to a good job, it can't be used. I think most people view this as ridiculous, and we've been working to fix that for several years. The challenge is how you can limit the use of the Pell Grant to just quality programs. Last March, I introduced the Jobs to Compete Act to expand Pell Grant eligibility to adults with high-quality short-term training programs. And the others introduced other bills, and I'm proud now to have joined you and Representative DeSaulnier and Representative Stefanik with the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. This bill will create a framework to award students in high-quality short-term training programs a federal Workforce Pell Grant. By expanding the federal Pell Grant, Congress will help Americans get good-paying jobs and compete in the modern economy. Especially pleased that the bill ensures that credits earned in short-term programs will be stackable, portable, and prepare students for both the workforce and additional post-secondary education. It also establishes a robust quality assurance system to ensure that students receive high-quality instruction, have a strong return on their investment, and are prepared for the jobs in the high-skilled, high-wage, or high-demand occupations. The amendment in nature of a substitute builds on the existing language of H.R. 6585 to provide additional clarity for the Workforce Pell eligibility process. By providing adults more opportunities to participate in training programs through the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, Congress will ensure that more Americans will have a pathway to the middle class, and businesses will be able to hire workers with the skills they need. The Commonwealth of Virginia has several community college initiatives that have been found to be able to increase student incomes by 25, 50, even 100%. And this bill ensures that all students will be able to afford those kinds of programs. So I urge my colleagues to support the ANS and the underlying bill to better support the workforce needs of today's students and workers. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Thompson, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to commend you and Ranking Member once again for incredible work and dedication to this bill that students, employers, and workers have been waiting for. The Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act will finally allow students who are most in need to gain access to high-quality, short-term education programs that provide students and workers opportunities to quickly advance their careers. Once again, as the co-chair of the Bipartisan Career and Technical Education Caucus, this legislation will help more individuals climb the next rung on the ladder of opportunity as they earn their degree or certificate in one hand and multiple job offers in the other. We've all seen and heard from countless constituents, businesses, and industries regarding the shortage of workers with certain skills and certificates needed to fill critical roles. This skills gap is only made worse when low-income workers and students do not have the resources to access short-term programs that help them advance their careers. This legislation will finally provide more equal funding for students and workers to choose the education pathway that is right for them. I encourage all of my colleagues to support this common sense, long overdue legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. DeSaulnier, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you. I'm proud to join with you and thank Ranking Member Scott in introducing the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act to help low-income students and workers access training programs and advance in their careers. By expanding the highly effective Pell program to short-term workforce training programs, this bill will help fill workforce gaps and build a pathway to the middle class for students and workers of all ages. In a rapidly changing workforce, more employers are demanding more skilled training, but too often the cost of training programs keep workers from gaining skills they need to fill that demand. From the healthcare sector to information technology to the building and construction trades, the certifications and credentials that can be earned through short-term programs prepare workers for good-paying jobs. Reducing costs for short-term programs for meaningful post-secondary credentials will help connect more students and workers to the jobs they want and connect employers with trained workforce they desperately need and the country desperately needs to be competitive globally. I've long supported programs that would connect students of all ages to high-quality training programs to help them enter the workforce, and I'm very encouraged by this bipartisan bill before us today to finally make short-term training programs Pell eligible. I'm also proud to have worked with the authors in the committee to make sure we had strong performance standards to make sure that there are no abuses to the program. The important work we've done on reauthorization of WIOA in this committee is demonstrating a strong commitment to supporting students and workers in the career pathway of their choice. I strongly urge my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you, and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Moran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I speak today in favor of H.R. 6585, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. It prepares Americans for the 21st century economy by aligning education opportunities with workforce needs. This legislation in particular provides opportunities for students and workers looking to gain skills in high-demand fields by allowing Pell Grants to support students enrolled in high-quality, short-term workforce programs that will lead to their career advancement. Currently, you can't use a Pell Grant for a short-term training program like an IT course or a welding course, things that are very important to today's world that probably couldn't have been foreseen 1 or 2 decades ago. As a result, many cannot afford to attend or complete courses that will help them get good paying jobs. These are great opportunities for young adults, and right now they are missed opportunities. And it's not just young adults, it's adults of any kind that are trying to advance their careers. The theme here in this bill, 6585, includes things like flexibility, individual choice, upskilling of the workforce, broadening of opportunities outside of the typical 2 or 4 year degree program. It's themes that both sides of the aisle agree we should advance. The ones that will benefit most from 6585 include folks like low-income students, those seeking to advance their careers and better their lives by choosing pathways of their own passions while getting a great return on their investment. And even, as I mentioned, older students who may be stepping away from the workforce for a short term in their current position to enroll in a short-term education program, something they can't do maybe on a long-term basis, but on a short-term basis to upskill their current skills or to seek a new certification or advancement in their own workplace or in something nearby. You know, Congress should be supporting this kind of measure on both sides of the aisle, and I'm glad to see it happening. Currently, the HEA does not allow Pell Grants to be used for programs requiring less than 600 hours or 15 weeks of instruction. This Pell Act allows that to happen. Today, also, over 30% of enrolled students are considered non-traditional, which means students who are 25 years or older. Again, students that need to take time off from workforce, some of whom have kids and families to support, and this Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, 6585, allows them to do that, to gain additional skills, to better their lives, to follow their passions, and to do the things in this world that will create opportunities for their kiddos and their grandkids. With that, I strongly support this 6585 and ask my colleagues to do the same and urge its passage. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairwoman, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I rise in opposition to this legislation, and while I'm pleased to see the focus on expanding Pell to shorter workforce-related post-secondary educational opportunities, I have grave concerns with the expansion of Pell funding to for-profit programs. In short, I do believe that we need to move toward Pell, short-term Pell, but the way we do it is important. For those who do not pursue traditional college track, short-term traditional college track, short-term programs can serve as a more preferable option. Many Americans are interested in pursuing careers that do not require a bachelor's degree and are choosing to focus on skilled training instead. That is all well and good. But for many students interested in shorter workforce-related programs, hefty price tags stand as a barrier. Now, I understand this bill is intended to be a compromise, but my trepidation, my trepidation is that we are opening a Pandora's box by cracking the door open for for-profit institutions to receive federal funding. I fear the for-profit motive is too great and will pave the way for deceptive practices. And one of the reasons I ran for Congress was because I witnessed firsthand the abuse of recruiters from for-profit colleges aggressively recruiting and luring students into low-quality programs. And for years, I have sounded the alarm on the for-profit system and how egregious the predatory actions of for-profit universities have defrauded and harmed students. Too many women, minorities, and veterans have fallen prey. And as the former chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee and now the ranking member, I've seen countless instances of our men and women in uniform being preyed on and targeted for the sheer benefit of their GI Bills. These GI Bill benefits. These heroes were viewed as nothing more than dollar signs, viewed as a means to line the pockets of unscrupulous actors with the sole goal of increasing profit margins. I consistently advocated for closing the 90-10 loophole, a measure in which for-profit colleges would receive the majority of their GI Bill tuition money. And to be more succinct, or to be more precise, they would find ways to get around the 90% limitation on the receipt of federal funds. 90% already, and they found more ways to bring federal money into their coffers. Predatory for-profit colleges took significant advantage of the 90-10 loophole to cheat veterans and service members out of their educational benefits, and all the while providing them with a low-quality education and burdensome debt load. This rule was put into place to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse of federal education dollars, but for-profits exploited the loophole to earn millions in profits. And to add insult to injury, when some of these for-profits shut down suddenly, taxpayers were left with the bill. By closing this loophole, Congress deemed holding predatory for-profits accountable, that it was necessary to hold them accountable and to safeguard federal education benefits and ultimately protect taxpayers and students. It took years for Congress to address this issue, and I was thrilled to see this fixed under the American Rescue Plan in 2021. 90-10 was meant to force these schools to show that they could stand on their own, meaning the schools would not be dependent on the federal government. And guess what? Closing that loophole proved that some of these schools, actually many of these schools, could never stand on their own 2 feet. If a school wishes to operate for profit, the least we can expect is that they can make their profits in the free market. After all, isn't that what the GOP majority believes in? That the market will decide. This bill means taxpayers will be directly paying into these profits, socializing the losses while privatizing the gains. My worry is that we are opening the doors for for-profit programs and witnessing, again, for-profit universities maneuvering and solely serving their best interests. We know that students attending for-profit colleges are less likely to graduate than those at public colleges and more likely to default on their loans across the board. We've repeatedly seen these types of programs continue to fail students but collect their funds indiscriminately. And despite the assurances that 10% of for-profits would be deemed eligible to participate in the short-term Pell bill, 10% is simply too high a risk to bear. No for-profit programs should be included in this legislation, and while I appreciate the guardrails included in the bill aiming to curb some of the predatory practices often exhibited by for-profit entities, I fear these guardrails will not suffice. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Tucano. Mr. Grossman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Me? Oh, sorry. Well, I'd like to thank the chair for bringing forth this bill. I love tech schools. I talk them up whenever I can. I think next week I'm going to be in the Omro High School telling those kids to make sure they take advantage of their tech schools, and frequently they'll be much better off than they are with a 4-year degree. That being said, I have a few concerns in this bill, and got to see what we're going to do with them. One of the pay-fors, we're dealing with schools with high endowments, given the number of kids they have. And those schools, if they're private schools, not if they're public schools, if they're private schools, as I understand it, they will not be able to give out loans to their students, and they use that endowment right now to give out scholarships to those students as well. It's one of 2 medical colleges or medical universities in the state of Wisconsin, and they believe, as currently drafted, this pay-for would shut them down or, at a minimum, drastically change the way they have to operate. And it'll be a big problem for the Medical College of Wisconsin, and they feel there are at least well over 50 other colleges in the country that are a problem for them. They do point out that you're going to continue to be able to get the loans if you go to the University of Wisconsin Medical School, which is the government school, but their private school, you won't be able to get the loans. My second concern about Pell Grants, I don't know exactly how to address it, is the formula for Pell Grants, like the formula for so many other programs, gives the grants to some people and not other people. I have heard several times on 4-year Pells in which people complain because they're middle-class sort of people, their kids aren't eligible, but maybe they have a sister or something. The case I'm thinking of has a sister who has not middle class, and her kid gets the Pell. So why am I a middle-class parent and my kid's 40 grand in debt, and my sister, who is eligible for Pell, winds up with almost no debt? They feel it's unfair, and it is unfair. I realize that here we're talking about much smaller amounts. These Pell Grants will probably, talking to my local tech school, might be routinely as little as $500 a kid. Nevertheless, on principle, I've always had somewhat of a problem with Pell Grants here. I do know in the state of Wisconsin we're very generous to our tech schools. I'm told our tuition is smaller than other states already, which is a subsidy to everybody, and more the type of subsidy I like, in which the subsidy goes equal for everybody. My other concern here is if you read the language of the bill, I think it anticipates more credentialism. And I've always fought credentialism. But in any event, I do believe the bill will pass today. I love the fact that my chairman is trying to do more to tip the scale more towards the tech schools, and I am confident that this pay for will somehow be solved by the time this bill hits the floor. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grossman. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Thank you. Although this bill provides critical funding for short-term training programs, I do have a few concerns that I would like to address. Despite the growing need for short-term training programs, many are unable to access them because of lack of funding. Currently, you can't use a Pell Grant for short-term programs, including welding. So the comments that Ranking Member Scott made about it, I think, were good. Students and workers looking to gain skills outside of the traditional confines of higher education will be able to access grant funding if this bill is enacted. These high-quality short-term workforce programs will lead to much-needed career establishment and advancement. And we need to ensure that we remove any and all barriers to education and workforce training. Pell Grants, since their establishment, have provided much-needed access to education funds for students, especially those who couldn't afford it. Nationwide, 34% of undergraduate students receive the Pell Grant, and the average Pell Grant award is $4,491. This grant has decreased the need for students to borrow student loans and has created opportunities for minority students and first-generation college students, as I was. Creating Pell access to short-term credentials will provide a path to quality jobs and higher earnings for individuals who want to move quickly into in-demand occupations or who would benefit from upskilling or retraining. Not only will the bill provide critical funding, but it will also ensure that programs provide students with relevant education and competencies necessary for employment in in-demand industries. Program eligibility for the Workforce Pell Grant is based on completion rate and verified job placement, among other factors. It also outlines a process for recognized accreditors to oversee Workforce Pell programs at the institutions that accredit. This will ensure that students and worker outcomes are favorable for them to attain jobs. Although this bill provides critical support for our students and our workforce, there are some aspects that I'm very concerned about. For example, for-profit colleges to be included in an expansion of federal student aid as proposed by the bill, I do have some concerns. Additionally, there aren't enough guardrails to protect students from the aggressive tactics that some of these institutions use, although I know some of them do very well. But we've had situations, for example, in my district, and I spoke to it some time ago, regarding a school, the Charlotte School of Law, that really left students without degrees, without money to go on, and the school just shut down. So these guardrails that are here don't seem to be adequate enough in protecting vulnerable students who are defrauded or preyed on by these institutions. And so I'm still concerned about that. There's no recourse that these students have if they lose out on the critical funding. It's impacted students of color, veterans, and low-income students. And I just believe that we have to have a system in place that will protect these kinds of behaviors and so that they don't go unchecked. The Office of Federal Student Aid has failed in many cases to hold for-profit colleges accountable. And so I want to make sure that these instances will not continue to happen. As I mentioned, schools in North Carolina have been negatively impacted, and the future that they hoped that was promised to them was not really given to them. But this bill does remove critical federal funding for institutions of higher education that pay endowment tax. So hopefully we can continue to work on it and solidify and at least get some of the questions and concerns that I, along with some of my colleagues, have raised and make this legislation work better for our workforce. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
No.
Thank you. I'm speaking about H.R. 6585, and I will support the bill, but I also want to get on the record some of my concerns. As the other co-chair of the Career and Technical Education Caucus, I appreciate the work that's gone into this bill. But some of you may know I have a consumer protection background, so I'm extremely concerned about funds going to nonprofit entities. I do appreciate the many guardrails which are included in the bill, which is why I'm going to be supporting it. And I just want to mention a few of those. The earnings metrics are important. In fact, in a March 2023 report on short-term Pell Grants, the Urban Institute estimated that only 8% of short-term programs at for-profit institutions would pass the value-add earnings metric that's in the bill. Adverse actions are addressed. Specifically, institutions are only eligible to receive workforce Pell Grants if they've not been subject to any suspension or termination under Title IV of the Higher Education Act, or any adverse action ending in the revocation of denial of accreditation, or any action by a state that revokes the institution's authority to operate. So those provisions together help ensure that poor quality for-profit institutions that have a record do not have access to Pell Grants. There's also a requirement of regular and substantive interaction between students and faculty, and that's important because that's where we see a lot of the significant concern with online for-profit coursework. Also, it's not for new programs that are created. For example, all programs have to be in existence for at least a year prior to receiving Workforce Pell, and if they no longer meet the requirements, they won't be eligible for at least 3 years, which is a significant penalty. And then finally, and importantly, the gainful employment rule. All of these programs will be subject to the gainful employment rule, which has a pretty robust process for weeding out low-quality for-profit and certificate programs from participating. So with those guardrails, of course, we'll be keeping a close eye on those going forward, and importantly, in implementation and enforcement. I'll be supporting the bill. I also want to note my significant concerns about what's in Section 7, which is the funding mechanism. I question the wisdom of targeting private schools with endowments as the pay-for this. When people donate to a college or university, that their intent is that's what that money is used for, not to pay for programs that we should be funding in higher education. So I want to raise that concern. I know Representative McBath has an amendment. If it comes forward for a vote, I'll be supporting it to delete Section 7. But I just wanted to get that on the record as well, that the funding mechanism makes no sense in this bill. So I will be supporting the bill, and I'm going to yield any of my remaining time to Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you.
Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, it's just the remaining time. The gentleman from California and others have pointed out the challenge about for-profits. Let me just say that the last thing we need, with all the problems we've had with for-profits, is to allow storefront operations to open up and take all the Pell money and then deal out worthless certificates. But this bill, as the gentlelady from Oregon says, has strong quality control measures. In fact, the Urban Institute estimates that 90% of the for-profit colleges will not be able to meet those standards. And we put in even more controls after that study was done. The gentlelady from Oregon gave similar statistics, and most will not be able to qualify. Also, we have strong accrediting controls. One problem we've had with for-profits over the years is that low-quality programs are accredited, and this we have more stringent provisions in this bill, so we expect the accreditors to exclude the low-quality programs, and this committee will be providing oversights. There are some for-profits that provide quality programs at reasonable prices, and they should be able to participate. And by the way, there are also some low-quality nonprofit programs that will not be able to meet the standards, and they will not be able to participate. And finally, several comments have been made about the pay for. One of the challenges we have in this committee is that we have limited jurisdiction. We can cut school lunches, Title I formulas, other job training programs, so we're kind of limited in what we can do. The comments that have been made are well taken, and we're going to be looking for ways to improve the pay for. I would hope that we could go forward as it is, as we seek other ways to pay for the legislation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Ms. McBath, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, and I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
The workforce shortages that we continue to see across the country are in dire need of being addressed, and expanding Pell Grant eligibility for programs that are less than 15 weeks is not only sorely needed, but it also just makes common sense. The length of a program should not be the sole deciding factor in determining whether a program is accomplishing its intended purpose. If a program can prove that it's getting students to where they want to go in life, if the program is actually helping them to increase their income and gain the necessary skills that our country needs them to have, then we should be encouraging them to do that very thing. There are millions of working people who do not have time or the money to obtain a 2 to 4 year degree, but yearn for the opportunity to improve their station in life through education. With the appropriate guardrails, as we've said over and over again today, short-term programs offer them a tangible path to a better life, a realistic way to make their families live better as quickly as they possibly can. For too long, we have been sending the wrong message that a classic 4-year degree is the only option for students to be successful, which we all know is not true. It's a disservice to our students and to our needs as a nation, and I am pleased to see that we're finally doing something to change that. Understanding that this bill is a compromise, I do have concerns about certain provisions, as others do as well, and their impact on private schools who also operate hospitals like my hometown hospital in Georgia, Emory University. The intent of the offset is to require institutions with large endowments to meet the financial needs of all students. However, it does not take into account certain situations. If Emory were to split their health care system out and operate as a separate health care system and university, their endowment would decrease significantly, making it so that they would be beneath the threshold and not be subject to the endowment tax. Schools like Emory should not be wrongly grouped in with other institutions because they provide the critical service of overseeing one of Georgia's and the entire nation's most important healthcare systems. As an academic healthcare center, endowments for Emory Hospital system sit with the school, making this a truly unique situation that deserves special attention, and I hope that we can all take this into account. I thank the chair and the ranking member once again for their important work on this bill and the staff as well, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. McBath. There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. For what purpose does Ms. Jayapal seek to be recognized?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6585 offered by Ms. Jayapal of Washington, identifier JAYAPA_081.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the chair and the ranking member for working towards a bill that would finally help students receive a Pell Grant for short-term programs. This means more students would be able to afford pathways to economic success while reducing the burden of student loan debt. But I do have serious concerns with some aspects of the bill. For example, as written, for-profit colleges would have access to this proposed taxpayer-funded grant. Too many for-profit institutions have a distressingly strong record of fraud and predatory behavior towards students. For this reason, I'm offering this amendment, which would exclude for-profit programs from Pell funding. For-profit programs are frequently high-cost, low-quality options that fail to deliver on job placement and increased earnings. 2/3 of career programs offered by for-profit colleges already result in graduates earning no more than a high school graduate degree. I appreciate this bill's inclusion of accountability measures, but for-profits have already demonstrated that they are willing and able to create loopholes to deceive regulators and abuse taxpayer funds. For example, the 2014 Gainful Employment Rule also allowed programs who failed their metrics to submit appeals. In one instance, a for-profit program claimed that tipped income was not properly counted towards earnings and provided a survey they claimed accurately reflected their graduates' earnings, 73% higher than the IRS estimate for this missing data. Their appeal was granted. However, some have found that data to be inflated and misrepresentative of what those unreported tips really were worth. Researchers found that the for-profit's claim was incorrect. Unreported tipped wages were higher than the IRS estimate, but just by 8%, not by 73% like the for-profits claimed. I appreciate that this bill ensures programs with histories of federal student aid violations will be ineligible, but not all administrations make good faith efforts to enforce Title IV. During the Trump administration, the Office of Federal Student Aid failed to protect students when their for-profit colleges misrepresented student outcomes. In fact, the last administration drew widespread concern when it drastically reduced the investigation and enforcement staff. Moreover, I also believe that students simply shouldn't have to wait to be defrauded or abused by a sector that is rampant with abusive practices. It's our duty to step in and prevent students from known harms. Allowing for-profit programs to access short-term Pell poses a significant risk to Pell-eligible students. Students who receive Pell come from lower-income families who would benefit most from a post-secondary education. 88% of Black students and 81% of Latino students receive Pell. Together, they face unique barriers to college access and completion, but for-profit colleges are unfit to ensure their success. Black borrowers who attended for-profits were more likely to default than repay their loans, and Hispanic borrowers are 41% more likely to default. In general, the default rate at for-profit colleges is twice that for public institutions. Despite these outcomes, for-profit colleges have been found to disproportionately target Black and Latino communities, contributing to racial income inequality and exacerbating disparities in educational outcomes. Since this bill makes the grant count towards a student's lifetime Pell eligibility, they will have less resources to complete a four-year degree if they choose to without taking on student loans. We simply should not risk the Pell eligibility, time, and futures of our most vulnerable students on for-profit institutions. That's why I'm planning to reintroduce the Student Not-Profits Act to keep for-profit colleges out of the federal student aid system and to improve transparency for how they transfer to nonprofit status. Improving accountability and transparency in that way is key. It makes sure that public colleges and nonprofits can provide the support that these students deserve to achieve the promise of a post-secondary education without the burden of student debt. Congress has a clear role and incentive in keeping the for-profit institutions away from federal student aid. In hopes that these conversations on protecting students can continue and that the Senate can address these concerns, I'm offering this amendment. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Does the gentlewoman withdraw her amendment? Oh, Mr. Takano, you're recognized to speak on the Jayapal amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. I agree with my colleague from the state of Washington that opening up short-term Pell to for-profit institutions puts our students at risk. They do not have a good track record. Too many of them have not had too many of them have shown to have been bad actors in the past, and they've shown an ingenious way to game the system. It was mentioned by the ranking member that there are guardrails in place in terms of accreditation and oversight of this committee. With all due respect, I do not have much faith in accreditation bodies. The accreditation bodies specifically were manipulated by the for-profit institutions. And they created their own accreditation system. As far from administration to administration, my colleague from Washington also makes a good point that we just can't count on consistent oversight from the Department of Education, as well as whether this committee has the resources. I will say that in the veterans space, there were state authorizing agencies that were supposed to be a part of overseeing the quality of these programs. Historically, we tried to have fixed the problem of them being properly resourced, but I remain concerned about whether or not the many states and the many attorney generals, the many different state bodies which would play a role in overseeing the quality of these programs are adequately funded, and whether or not the Department of Education is adequately resourced to oversee these programs. Look, we have seen a huge, we can already see from our history with for-profits that we've already conducted a massive pilot program of how this model of education works. It doesn't work. It took Congress, I said, decades to actually address the issue of the 90-10 rule. I fear that this is a huge mistake. I realize that there's a compromise being struck here, but this is a compromise that I cannot live with. And let me talk more about the absurdity of the pay for, which has not been fully analyzed by the CBO. So we're passing a bill which has not been paid for, which has not gotten a CBO score, and the pay for mechanism, which would essentially say that those institutions that are subject to the endowment tax are not going to be able to offer direct federal student loans to their students. Now, for Pell Grant recipients, they are protected. But I'm going to tell you, I did not qualify for Pell, but I certainly needed to be able to access a substantial loan from one of these universities that is eligible, that is subject to the endowment tax. I could not have attended university without a federal direct student loan. Well, what will be the consequence for this class of students who are lower middle class students? They will be subject to predatory lending institutions, private lending institutions, to get their loans. So what sense does it make that we are now subjecting one group of students who will no longer be able to get their federal direct student loans in order to pay for the risk of taking on these for-profit institutions? This bill is far from the compromise that I'd like to see. I would love to see us work out a way for short-term Pell to be available to programs which will allow students who do not want to go to a four-year institution or a two-year institution to get high-value, high-quality training opportunities. I do not see that this is ready for prime time, and I yield back.
Would the
my
gentleman
time.
yield?
I yield the time back. I yield whatever time remains to Ms. McBath.
Thank you so much to my colleague, Mr. Takano. And I do want to say that, even though we know that there are shortcomings, we know there's still a lot of work yet to be done. I know I've listened very closely to the concerns of each of my colleagues here today on both sides of the aisle, and I too myself am withdrawing my amendment, the amendment that I had for the pay for as well. But I am absolutely confident that this committee, with the bipartisan work that we're doing now, I'm confident we will continue to work and chip away and really refine this piece of policy, refine this work so that each and every student will be able to afford the assistance, the financial assistance that they need, but most importantly, that they deserve. And I yield back.
Madam Chair, in deference to the bill moving forward, I will withdraw my amendment. I will be voting no, just to make sure we address this in the Senate, but I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chair Paul. Thank you, Ms. McBath. Mr. Scott, Do you wish to be recognized?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Takano, you're recognized. The
Madam
clerk will
Chair-
designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6585 offered by Mr. Takano of California. Identifier Takano_0.
Madam Chair.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The intent behind my amendment is quite simple, is to exclude online programs from being eligible to participate in the short-term Pell expansion. I have significant concerns with granting short-term Pell grant funding to online programs and worry that the floodgates may be opening for predatory actors. The modality of an online program is one that can be particularly challenging for several reasons. From the lack of in-person instruction, technical issues, and limited, if at all, hands-on experience, fully online programs pose inherent challenges in providing successful learning opportunities. The remote nature of online learning may also further the inequities for low-income students that do not have reliable and affordable internet access. These dynamics prove difficult in setting students up for success. Research has suggested those who sign up for online programs do not thrive academically and are less likely to continue enrollment in contrast to peers attending programs face-to-face. For students of color, the inequities only worsen and the risks are greater. In many instances, students are forced to pay for more online programs than they would for in-person brick-and-mortar instruction. In a recent 2020 study, 69% of students indicated they felt in-person instruction was more effective than online instruction. The expansion of short-term Pell is intended to assist individuals in assessing and accessing post-secondary workforce training. However, many skills and occupations simply cannot be taught virtually, and for many professions, the hands-on dynamic is of the utmost importance. Professions in healthcare, for example, as one can imagine, would merit critical training from a hands-on approach. A virtual learning program simply would not suffice. Online programs are itching to access Pell grants, and the risk we would be assuming with the underlying legislation is significant. If we are serious about pursuing high-quality and high-value measures, online programs are not the most viable option in helping students succeed. Some might argue that short-term Pell programs, can offer valuable focused skills training and may align with the evolving needs of the workforce. However, we have seen the lack of depth of learning, and many times poor program completion rates paint a different picture in the effectiveness of these programs. If we are to allow short-term Pell to extend to online programs, we are making conditions ripe for abuse. Let us never forget the reason why Pell was created and remain true to that commitment. Pell was created to further the investment in students that otherwise would not be afforded the opportunity to pursue higher education. In that same spirit, we must ensure that all necessary action are taken to preserve the integrity of Pell funding and safeguard taxpayer dollars. Expanding Pell to online programs does not achieve that goal, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly understand the gentleman from California's concerns about allowing online programs to benefit from the Workforce Pell grants, and I agree that in-person is better than online. And that's why I work to ensure that only online programs that provide regular and substantial interaction between students and their instructors can be eligible. There's some people that can't get there in person and can only benefit online, and whether or not they should be excluded from participation is a policy question. If it's a quality program that can produce the results measured by the quality control measures in the bill, I think they should. And that's why they're allowed with those conditions. Of course, in-person is better than online, but you don't want to leave out people that can only get there online. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Takano.
I understand that I will not stand in the way of the bill. Moving forward, I will withdraw my amendment, but I will be voting no in the hopes that the Senate will fix and address the concerns that I have about the bill.
I thank the gentleman for withdrawing his amendment. Pursuant to the chair's there being no further amendments, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6585 as amended, 6585. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
Madam Chair, we have
Ms.
a
Jayapal.
recorded vote.
That's the amendment, nature of substitute, it's not final passage.
Right. Before the committee continues, I want to recognize a guest that I have in the audience today. Ms. Finley Revels is a senior from Mitchell County in my district, and she's shadowing me this week, and she's been extremely patient this morning sitting through this entire discussion, and I think she deserves to be recognized for that. I appreciate her being here. The committee will now proceed to consideration of the bill H.J. Res. 98 for amendment. The resolution was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
H.J. Res. 98, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the rule submitted by the National Labor Relations Board relating to standard for determining joint employer status.
Without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with. Without objection, the resolution will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the resolution? Mr. James, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to thank you and your staff for your professionalism and leadership, especially on moving this important measure forward. I speak in support of H.J. Res. 98, my resolution of disapproval on the National Labor Relations Board's joint employer rule. My family is not a stranger to the American dream. I am the walking result of the American dream. My father started his business with one truck, one trailer, and no excuses. And I know many franchise owners know what I'm talking about and share our story. Starting a small business is no small task. It takes grit, patience, and determination. In some cases, it might feel overwhelming, but that moment when it all comes together makes it all worth it. Today, in Joe Biden's America, we see another attempt by out-of-touch bureaucrats to sidestep the hard work and sacrifice that franchise owners have undergone. I thought America was about hard work, high reward. What is the incentive here to dream, to become a value-added person in your community? In Michigan's 10th Congressional District, the dread that this regulation has created cannot be overstated. American Speedy Printing in Shelby Township has been in business with their franchise for over 50 years, passing down through 2 generations. They paid the royalties every month for all those decades. The owner's now planning to retire early, planning to retire earlier than expected just to avoid this regulation from taking effect. Z-Bar International, a 65-year-old franchisor with multiple franchise locations across the Midwest and 2 locations in Utica and Clinton Township in my district, has expressed significant concerns about the NLRB's rule and their future. Z-Bar is not in charge of the daily operations of the stores. Neither does it make sense for their business model. Where's the common sense? Now, this concern is not just in my district. Groups across the country representing healthcare, trucking, construction, franchise, manufacturing, restaurant, retail industries, among many others, are publicly urging Congress to do the right thing and reject this misguided rule. The last time the NLRB implemented this destructive regulation, it led to 1.7 million fewer private sector jobs. If President Joe Biden is truly the champion of the middle class, as he claims to be, I truly hope that he signs my CRA into law instead of allowing this unnecessary and burdensome regulation to stifle growth, which will only hurt working families and small business and kill the American dream. I urge my colleagues to support H.J. Res. 98. Madam Chairwoman, thank you for your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. James. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the National Labor Relations Board final rule on joint employment status is a significant victory for workers, law-abiding businesses, and our economy. Unfortunately, the committee Republicans are again aiming to undo the progress made by the Biden administration by advancing H.J. Res. 98. If implemented, this resolution would repeal the NLRB's 2023 rule and restore a deficient Trump-era rule that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has stated is inconsistent with common law principles. If we return to the Trump's 2020 standard, more employers will be able to avoid their bargaining obligations despite having a form of control over another employer's workers, denying many workers the right to collectively bargain over their pay, benefits, and working conditions, and leave small employers on the hook for labor violations that are a result of another employer's actions. The NLRB 2023 rule returns the joint employer test to the common law principles of employment and ensures that workers can bring entities with the power to control their working conditions to the bargaining table. If you're going to have bargaining, you have to have at the table the entity that actually controls the conditions of employment. If one entity sets the salary, say the workplace, the temp agency that technically hired you and put you at the workplace, if the workplace sets the salary, having only the temp agency at the table is a waste of time. They can't adjust the salary. The salary's been set by the real employer. And so if you follow the Trump era rules, you have to sit up there and negotiate with the temp agency that has no ability to adjust the salaries. By holding employers accountable for their bargaining obligations when they do exercise control, even through an intermediary, the organized workers can engage in meaningful negotiations and share in the prosperity they have worked hard to create. So I ask unanimous consent to enter 2 letters into the record. One, the letters are signed by a diverse array of stakeholders, including the AFL-CIO, Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the National Organization for Women, and 3 pages of other signatures. Ask that they be entered into the record.
Without objection. So ordered.
With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized, Mr. Allen.
I rise in support of H.J. Res. 98 legislation that will work to overturn the National Labor Relations Board's finalized expanded joint employer standard. In October, President Biden's radical NLRB appointees circumvented Congress to reimpose a broad joint employer standard that threatens the flexibility of business owners and upends the franchise model as we know it, which has created tremendous wealth in this country. In fact, in a report released by the International Franchise Association, 74% of franchises expressed a high level of concern at the prospect of increased franchisor control, and 66% of franchisees expected the new standard to raise barriers to entry into franchising. Having started several businesses, I know all too well how additional hurdles and barriers to entrepreneurship will stifle innovation. At a time when workers and families are struggling to keep up with the inflationary reality of Bidenomics, it is appalling that this administration is now saddling entrepreneurs with further roadblocks. In particularly, the NLRB final rulemaking introduces ambiguity and potential legal pitfalls for employers. By adopting a more expansive definition of joint employment, the NLRB has opened the door to increased litigation and compliance challenges, which many small businesses simply do not have the resolve to handle. What we're seeing is an attempt to regulate small businesses out of business. I am proud to co-sponsor this common sense CRA to overturn the NLRB's heavy-handed joint employer rule that threatens to disrupt the delicate ecosystem that employs
millions of Americans. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to speak in opposition to HJ Res 98, and to start by saying, here we go again. We have had this same conversation many times over many years. I want to address the specific claim that the joint employer rule will threaten the franchise model. Now, I'll tell you a little something about myself. Several years ago when I practiced law, my specialty was in representing franchisees. So I know how this model works. Franchisees are small business owners. And I want to also note that the National Labor Relations Board has never issued a final decision finding a franchisor to be a joint employer of its franchisees' employees. And they will continue to not find a franchisor to be a joint employer if the franchisor acts like a franchisor and its control is limited to the brand and does not extend into the franchisee's labor relations. That's the way it should be. The franchisee is a small business owner. They make their own decisions about employment issues. In fact, the joint employer rule actually benefits franchisees. A strong joint employer standard actually prevents franchisors from coming in and dictating franchisees' employee relations while leaving the franchisees on the hook for liability. That would be problematic if the franchisors are telling the franchisees what to do. That's not their role. So for this reason, the American Association of Franchisees has actually written letters in support of both the PRO Act's joint employer standard and the Biden administration's NLRB's proposed joint employer rule. So, Madam Chair, this argument that this is somehow threatening the franchise model is not accurate. If in fact franchisees are concerned, is because they're getting misinformation about how the rule works. They know when they get the facts that they will benefit from a strong joint employer rule. So I just want to get that on the record, and for those reasons and more, I oppose HJ Res 98 and encourage my colleagues who support small businesses and everyone else to oppose this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Moran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Madam Chair, I speak today in support of HJ Resolution 98 that would seek to overturn the National Labor Relations Board's new joint employer rule. This Congressional Review Act resolution that's presented before us today is very necessary to protect the franchisee model, not only the franchisee model, but the staffing model. I know about both. Before coming to Congress, I was a staffing company owner, but I owned a franchise staffing company. So I've seen it on both ends. The new rule that's been passed by the NLRB, under this new rule, a joint employer relationship is established when employers share and co-determine whether directly or indirectly employees' essential terms and conditions of employment. The board may also determine that joint employer status exists when two or more employers exercise or reserve the right of control, even if this right is never exercised, whether directly or indirectly, employees' essential terms and conditions of employment. And under this new rule, indirect or the, quote, reserved right to control, again, even if it's never exercised, standing alone can establish a joint employer status. The list of essential terms and conditions of employment was also greatly expanded under this new rule to include wages, benefits, other compensation, hours of work, and scheduling, the assignment of duties, supervision of the performance of duties, work rules, discipline, hiring and discharge, and work conditions related to the safety of employees. And in fact, it makes it so broad that the franchisee-franchisor model simply would go away in many instances. For the staffing business in particular, I can tell you it squeezes you on both sides, because as a franchise owner with a franchisor, that franchisor would now pass down additional, more significant costs to the franchisee, which creates additional barriers to entry as a small business owner. Many small business owners in this world enter the world of small business ownership through the franchisee model, and in fact, many minorities and those of low income benefit from this model, and they would have additional barriers to entry if this NLRB rule stays in place. It would also reduce control on the local level, because now if the franchisor is going to be liable for what happens at the franchisee level, they're going to want to control more and more of it. And effectively, we're going to undo the separation between the franchisee and the franchisor that currently exists. The second thing that it does, and it squeezes, in particular, staffing companies, is it squeezes them on the other end. As staffing companies, we often would, our whole goal is to place associates in with clients that need folks on a temporary basis or a short-term basis or a trial basis. Under this new proposed rule, our clients would now be joint employers with the franchise company, again, squeezing the profits of that franchise staffing model in the middle. They would restrict additional control and actually impose additional control that is usually reserved for the franchisee staffing company that is making the placements to the associates. And frankly, what that does is that makes the ability to place associates at clients' locations untenable in many situations, because the burden now shared only by the franchise would now be shared by the franchisor, squeezed down to the franchise, and squeezed by the client that is receiving the placement of the associate. They're passing back costs to the franchise in the middle, so it provides no opportunities for staffing companies to thrive, which is important, because this is this is an important way to get employees placed in new locations for trial basis, where companies can know whether or not this person is skilled, where they only need them for a short term or on a trial basis. Is very important model to get people into the workplace, and for employers who oftentimes are scrapping for workers left and right. It gives them the ability to find the right fit of a worker before they hire them permanently. But if this rule goes through unchallenged, we're going to see that model go away, and that would be a real shame, because I can tell you there were thousands of individuals in East Texas where we put people to work, giving them a second chance to start their life over again through both a franchise model and a staffing model. And in this particular instance, this new NLRB joint employer rule would do away with that opportunity. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to support HJ Resolution 98, the Joint Employer Congressional Review Act, which will overturn the NLRB's misplaced new joint employer rule. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Ms. Jayapal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Madam Chair, this joint resolution introduced by my Republican colleagues is unfortunately nothing more than a partisan attack to help large companies avoid accountability for their workers and diminish the collective power of low-wage workers and the labor movement, which happens to be at its strongest point in recent history. Let's be clear, any employer that has control over an employee's essential terms and conditions of employment should be required to be at the bargaining table and be held responsible for unfair labor practices, period. I am proud that the National Labor Relations Board under the Biden administration has issued a strong joint employer standard that is in line with the board's interpretation of joint employer for the majority of the time since the National Labor Relations Act was enacted nearly a century ago in 1935. Furthermore, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the NLRB's proposed joint employer rule under the Biden administration is estimated to raise workers' earnings by over $1 billion annually. Across the country, over 3 million Americans are employed by a temporary staffing agency, performing work on behalf of a client company that often control large facets of their work, even if they don't write their paycheck. Under the Trump administration's rule, these companies could just avoid responsibility for their workers by disintegrating their workforce and using overlapping arrangements of contracting, subcontracting, franchising, and temping. For example, let's look at the franchise model as national chains are increasingly defaulting to franchising, like McDonald's, which only operates 7% of their stores. Despite only operating a very small percentage of their stores, McDonald's sets royalty fees, quality control requirements, and monitoring requirements, which financially strain franchisors and incentivizes them to drive down labor costs as their primary method to increase profits. McDonald's even directs workers on how to perform everyday tasks, ranging from greeting guests to mopping the floors. Furthermore, when McDonald's workers began organizing, corporate headquarters created positions specifically to focus on responding to organizing at franchised locations and organized a legal training for franchise owners on handling organizers. The issue of joint employer can also be demonstrated by Amazon's Delivery Service Partner Program, which uses over 3,000 delivery contract companies to build up Amazon's delivery network. Now, Amazon is headquartered in my district, and we're proud of the startup that has become a giant employer in the region and actually provides jobs to many of my constituents. But this program is a key example of the need for a strong joint employer standard. To many, these contracted workers look like Amazon employees. They wear Amazon vests, they drive in trucks with Amazon's logo, they have their routes predetermined by Amazon's algorithm, and they can even be fired by Amazon. When this program began, Amazon's control over driver schedules was so overbearing that several workers documented using, and this is a quote, urine bottles to stay on Amazon's schedule. Importantly, Amazon also sets the minimum pay for workers indirectly, though through the rate that they pay contractors. While contractors can and sometimes do pay workers higher than the minimum rate, workers can't secure meaningfully higher wages without the ability to hold Amazon accountable at the bargaining table for the rates that they pay their contractors. It's critical that any form of control an employer has, including indirect and reserved, is accounted for when determining a joint employer relationship, and this new rule from the Biden administration does just that. Now, let's be clear. This new joint employer rule only requires employers to bargain with employees on matters that they possess or have the authority to control. It should be common sense that if workers can't bring the employer that supervises their performance or controls their wages and hours to the bargaining table, they can't effectively organize. As the labor market changes and the use of staffing agencies and subcontracted workers becomes more common, it's critical that our labor laws keep pace. This thinly veiled attempt to target vulnerable and low-wage workers is unacceptable, and I look forward to this pro-labor, pro-worker rule going into effect early next year. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I move to strike the last word in opposition to this resolution.
You're recognized.
Madam Chair, the National Labor Relations Board issued a final rule this past October that restores the board's ability to consider the extent to which an employer controls the terms and conditions of someone's employment. So what does that mean exactly? This rule prevents employers from skirting accountability for complying with workplace laws. Under the previous administration, the Trump administration, a 2020 rule severely hampered the American workers' ability to hold employers responsible for wage theft, unfair labor practices, and other violations of workplace rights. And it also departed from court precedent. Unfortunately, a trend called fissured work has intentionally arisen over the years. Fissured work means when a company adopts a dynamic of contracting and subcontracting, much described in my colleague from Washington's arguments. We see this most commonly in the space of temporary work, of temping. And in America today, roughly 3.1 million Americans are employed by a temping agency. Now, these temporary work arrangements are characterized by their short duration, and employment can range from just a handful of days to months. So let's dive into an example of this. Let's say a company needs to hire a front desk receptionist and enlists the help of a staffing agency. So for an individual seeking a job opportunity who may not be able to secure full-time, long-term employment, maybe as quickly as he or she would like, a temporary staffing agency may seem enticing. So if hired, the receptionist sent out by the staffing agency would essentially be performing work on behalf of a client company that directs the company's work but does receive a check signed by the client company rather the staffing agency writes the check. This common practice is One, for companies to pay for employees to pay employees less for work than a traditional full-time employee would receive, and many times have hostile and unsafe workplaces. Now, the nature of fissured work arrangements at temp agencies often results in a lack of clarity regarding employer responsibilities and may become challenging for workers who are interested in organizing a union to negotiate collectively or hold employers accountable for labor standards. So, for that receptionist who wants to negotiate his or her pay, the conversation with the company proves difficult to have. We are in the midst of a moment where this type of fissured work is unfortunately rampant, and it is critical that companies are not able to evade bargaining and responsibility of workers. This is the problem that the Biden NLRB joint employer rule seeks to fix. If a company maintains its right to control how much a worker earns, how many hours they work, and whether they can organize, then it also must maintain its responsibility for complying with the laws that protect workers. This is common sense. The reality is that this rule actually helps workers and it protects small businesses that follow the rules. It does not hurt them by any means. Republicans may further decry this rule will ultimately be the beginning of the end for small businesses and franchises. Attacking a rule that helps workers and law-abiding employers alike seems to shed a light on that party's values. This rule would upend the dynamic of allowing big companies to shield themselves from labor negotiations. Companies that engage in fissured employee arrangements will no longer be able to evade such responsibilities. And we have seen instances in the fashion industry perpetuate similar dynamics. By way of contracting labor overseas, fashion companies at times have turned a blind eye and avoided culpability for poor working conditions and paying workers subhuman wages. All companies should be held accountable, irrespective of how many workers or geographically where employers are stationed. The final rule is expected to take effect in February 2024. If only my Republican colleagues were equally focused on helping empowering workers. I urge opposition to the joint resolution, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. There being no further discussion on the resolution, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. There being no amendments, the question now occurs on the resolution H.J. Res. 88. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the resolution is agreed to. Mr. Scott asks for a recorded vote. We'll now move to consider the next bill. The committee will now proceed to consideration of the bill H.R. 3400 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3400 to amend the National Labor Relations Act to adjust the dollar thresholds for National Labor Relations Board jurisdiction over certain labor disputes and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize Congressman Good to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, but first the clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3400 offered by Mr. Good of Virginia, identifier H.R. 3400_ANS.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize Congressman Good for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'd like to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute for my legislation, the Small Business Before Bureaucrats Act. This bill reduces the number of businesses under the National Labor Relations Board's authority by codifying jurisdictional limits for the first time. The National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, was created as a neutral, independent federal agency to safeguard employee rights to organize, protect against unfair labor practices, and conduct secret ballot union elections. Today, spearheaded by radical General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo, it's anything but neutral. And too often it works to undermine the employee free choice that it was created to protect. There are countless examples of the NLRB's overt bias that harms employers and strips employees of the choice that the National Labor Relations Act is supposed to help secure. NLRB has issued a rule to undermine secret ballot elections. How can there be a fair union election if there are not secret ballots? The NLRB worked to make it harder for employees to decertify a union by allowing blocking charges again. Under these new rules, a union can delay a decertification election indefinitely by filing frivolous, unfair labor practice charges. Reports indicate that NLRB officials engaged in misconduct that undermined the integrity of Starbucks Workers United representation elections. Currently, the not-so-neutral NLRB can swoop in to resolve a labor dispute in retail businesses with revenue under $500,000 and non-retail businesses under $50,000. These thresholds haven't been updated since 1958, or 65 years. My bill updates all jurisdictional limits to modern standards by multiplying existing limits by 10, and then provides an annual adjustment factor that will allow these thresholds to grow with our economy. Once free from the NLRB influence, the rights of small business employees will be in much better hands. I believe that any grievances between employer and employee are best worked out in-house. But if a third party is needed, the law already says that where the NLRB does not exercise jurisdiction, states can intervene. This is another win for small businesses who are tired of mandates from Washington. The Small Business Bureaucrats Act sends a strong message of solidarity to business owners across the country who've been crushed by authoritarian COVID restrictions and helps protect them from further unwanted government intervention. My amendment in the nature of a substitute only adjusts the calendar years of the bill to accommodate the fact that we are almost in the new year. So I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3400, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, as my colleagues know, the National Labor Relations Board has statutory jurisdiction over private sector employers who do business above a certain dollar level. H.R. 3400 amends the National Labor Relations Act to significantly increase that dollar threshold for when the board has jurisdiction. For example, a retail company that does business of less than $500,000 per year is not currently subject to the NLRB's jurisdiction. H.R. 3400 will multiply that by 10 so that retail businesses that do less than $5 million in annual business will not be covered. So what is the impact? Well, according to the bill's author, my distinguished colleague from Virginia, has said that when the bill is implemented, over 50% of businesses will be exempt and will no longer come under NLRB jurisdiction. We can take his word for it. At the time when we're seeing a clear support for labor unions, according to Gallup polls, as well as surge in organizing among workers in diverse sectors, why would we want to go out of our way to ensure that fewer employees are covered by the National Labor Relations Act? But let's be clear, it's not just the workers who would be harmed. Our staff was initially advised that H.R. 3400 was going to be part of tomorrow's Help Subcommittee hearing examining several bills. However, the committee Republicans abruptly changed course and opted to mark up the bill today. Before that was apparent, our Democratic witness, Mr. Dick Griffin, former NLRB General Counsel, finalized his written testimony for the hearing, and in it he noted the harm of the bill to employers. He said, and I quote, "A substantial number of businesses will not be regulated by the uniform federal statute governing private sector labor relations, and thus would be subject to all kinds of union organizing activity that the NLRA currently limits. There would be no limits on recognition, picketing, or secondary boycotts, for example." That's a quote. Now, I'm not sure if this is an outcome that my colleagues on the other side want to see in H.R. 3400, but this is what they would unleash with it. This bill is bad for workers, employers, and it would have benefited from being vetted at a legislative hearing that the majority regrettably decided to bypass. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Chavez DeRemer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I recognize and appreciate the motive behind this bill, reducing bureaucratic burdens for the small business community, especially as the owner of a small business. But this bill goes past the mark for Oregon, and I'll be voting no on moving it out of committee. In my district, unions aren't the enemy of small businesses, they're a partner. I have roughly 5,000 constituents who are proud members of the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 555, many of whom work in local small grocery stores. And these workers and their employers have experienced the benefits of good union representation, especially through their health plans. There's a reason why in our country, one of the biggest opponents of Medicare for all are unions. That's because union-secured health plans are the best of the best, and workers will fight tooth and nail to keep those plans. And in Oregon, so would most small businesses. For years now, Oregon small businesses with Local 555 workers have enjoyed union-sponsored health coverage, freeing them of paying for health plans. In other words, the presence of Local 555 in the small business community has translated to employers having their employees' health benefits covered by the Local 555, meaning they've had more money to put back into their business and less of their workers have needed to depend on Medicaid, adding a win for taxpayers. Local 555, as a 30,000 member organization, is able to provide its members retirement plans with most, if not all, small businesses simply could never afford. If this bill becomes law, it would gut the NLRB board to a point that these workers couldn't have the NLRB in their corner when it comes to negotiate their contracts, which include the health and retirement plans. Now here's the thing. Small businesses benefit from the presence of unions, but ownership, leadership, and circumstances can change. As the owner of a small business, I know this better than most. And workers in my district, especially those in Local 555, deserve the stability a strong union provides. The owner of a business could change, but with Local 555, employee benefits wouldn't go anywhere. And you can't have a strong union without the presence of the NLRB. I don't pretend to tell my Republican colleagues how this bill will impact your districts. Oregon is unique in most cases, but I do believe we need to realign our discussions when it comes to unions. Nobody in the labor movement is a saint by any means, but there's a reason workers support and stay in their unions for years, even if those same workers are Republicans, while their union leaders are proud Democrats. Better health plans, retirement plans, wages, and work hours are apolitical. I understand I'm in the minority of our Republican conference, but this is what I was sent to Congress to do. And I would genuinely love the opportunity to discuss with all of you how important unions are in Oregon. Mr. Good, I know you and your staff have worked hard on this bill, and I want to acknowledge that. Madam Chair, thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. I yield myself 5 minutes. The Biden NLRB's radical pro-union decisions and regulations are wreaking havoc on small businesses, which are the lifeblood of the U.S. economy. The Small Businesses Before Bureaucrats Act is common sense legislation that would provide relief to many small businesses by shielding them from the bureaucratic overreach of the NLRB. It protects small businesses by raising the NLRB's jurisdictional monetary thresholds to reflect modern revenue levels and ensures that such thresholds accurately reflect the size of the economy each year. Bidenomics has produced record high inflation that has made the current NLRB jurisdictional thresholds woefully out of date. Raising the board's jurisdictional standards is an easy way to protect small businesses and entrepreneurs that lack the resources to hire an army of lawyers or HR staff to navigate the NLRB's red tape. American small businesses are still recovering from government-imposed shutdowns. The Small Businesses Before Bureaucrats Act would allow small businesses to operate without fear of the NLRB infringing on their right to make ends meet for their workers and their families. And I yield back. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. There being no amendments, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3400. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The business before the committee is the postponed. Having finished debate on the legislation before the committee today, we'll recess until 1:15, and we'll begin recorded votes promptly at 1:15.
Madam Chair, are you aware that we expect votes at 1:30?
I am.
Okay.
The committee will come to order to consider the unfinished business of recorded votes on the items before the committee today. I'm aware that votes will begin at approximately 1:30, so I'd like to get this done before then. We'll begin with a motion to report H.R. 3400, and I recognize Mr. Good. I recognize Mr. Thompson.
Madam Chair, I move the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 3400 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
Question now occurs on reporting H.R. 3400 as amended to the House with favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Thompson?
Aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg?
Aye.
Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Aye. Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Mr. Allen? Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes yes. Mr. Good?
Yes.
Mr. Good votes yes. Ms. McLean? Ms. Miller? Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes yes. Mr. James? Mr. James votes yes. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer? Ms. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Williams? Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici?
No.
Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano?
No.
Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no.
The clerk will call the names of the members who did not answer on the first roll call.
Mr. Wilson? Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes yes. Ms. McLean? Ms. Miller? Mr. Williams? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. McBath?
Yes. Chapel is recorded.
How is Ms. Jayapal recorded?
Ms. Jayapal is recorded as a no.
We're waiting on a couple of people. Two of yours are not coming. How is Mr. Grothman recorded?
Mr. Grothman is recorded as a yes.
Mr. Grothman is not recorded?
He is recorded as a yes.
As yet. How is Mr. Allen recorded?
Mr. Allen is not recorded. Mr. Allen votes yes.
How is Mr. Williams recorded?
Mr. Williams is not recorded.
Yes.
Mr. Williams votes yes.
How is Mr. Wilson recorded?
Mr. Wilson is not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Wilson votes aye.
How is Ms. Miller recorded?
Ms. Miller is not recorded.
Miller, yes.
Ms. Miller votes yes.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 23 yeas and 20 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion's agreed to. H.R. 3400 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. Chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. We'll now be voting on 3 amendments to the bill, H.R. 6655. The amendment offered by Good_02. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson?
No.
Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Walbert?
Yes.
Mr. Walbert votes yes. Mr. Grothman?
Yes.
Mr. Grothman votes yes. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes yes. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes yes. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes yes. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes yes. Ms. McLean?
Yes.
Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller?
Yes.
Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes yes. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes yes. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes yes. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. DeCano?
No.
Mr. DeCano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar?
You said so.
Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes no.
How is Ms. Stefanik recorded?
Ms. Stefanik is recorded as a yes. Ms. Stefanik changes her vote to a no.
Ms. Letlow, how is Ms. Letlow recorded?
Ms. Letlow is recorded as a yes. Ms. Letlow changes her vote to no.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 14 yeas and 30 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next vote is on the amendment offered by Mr. Good, underscore 120. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes of course. Ms. McLean?
No.
Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller?
Yes.
Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes yes. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer? Ms. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Saulnier? Mr. Saulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes no.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 5 yeas and 38 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. We now vote on the amendment offered by Mr. Good, underscore 121. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes yes. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes yes. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Ms. Letlow? Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes yes. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes yes. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer? Ms. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes no.
How is Mr. Smucker recorded?
Mr. Smucker is not recorded. Mr. Smucker votes no.
How is Mr. Grothman recorded?
Mr. Grothman is not recorded. Mr. Grothman votes yes.
Clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 12 yeas and 31 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. We'll now be voting on the amendment, the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6655 as amended. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment, the nature of a substitute, is agreed to. I now entertain a motion to report the bill H.R. 6655 as amended and recognize Mr. Owens.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the Committee on Education and Workforce report Bill H.R. 6655 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 6655 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Mr.
Madam
Wilson,
Chair, I asked for a recorded vote.
a recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes yes. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes aye. Mr. James? Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes aye. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes yes. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes yes. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes yes. Mr. DeCano? Mr. DeCano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes aye. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes aye.
How is Mr. Grothman?
Mr. Grothman is not recorded. Mr. Grothman votes yes.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 44 yeas and 1 nay.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 6655 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. We now move to H.R. 6585. I entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 6585 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with a recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 6585 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Mr. Takano requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox.
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele votes yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes yes. Ms. Lutlow. Ms. Lutlow votes aye. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Ms. Houchin. Ms. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Ms. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes yes. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano.
No.
Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman. Mr. Bowman votes no.
Okay. 131. Okay. The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 37 yeas and 8 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion's agreed to. H.R. 6585 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent the staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended without objection. So ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views without objection. So ordered. We now move to H.J. Res. 98. I will entertain a motion to report the resolution and recognize Mr. James.
Madam Chairwoman, I move the Committee on Education and Workforce report the resolution H.J. Res. 98 to the House of Representatives, and with the recommendation that the resolution be agreed to and the resolution do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.J. Res. 98 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes aye. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes aye. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes aye. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes aye. Ms. Latlow? Ms. Latlow votes aye. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes yes. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes aye. Mr. James? Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer? Chavez-DeRemer votes aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes aye. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Saban? Mr. Saban votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Mr. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes no.
The clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there were 25 yeas and 20 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to. H.J. Res. 98 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. Chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical conforming changes to the resolution as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, any members who wish to insert materials into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day. Mr. Grothman has asked for permission to speak out of order.
I appreciate you having that hearing that we had last week. I thought it had such high ratings, we might want to do a follow-up. Thank you.
If there's no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.